I was born on December 30th, 1997, nearly 26 years ago at the time I'm writing this, and just 2 days before the start of 1998, which means I can just barely say I was introduced to the world the same year as inarguably one of the best narrative-driven games ever made. While I wouldn't play that particular game for myself until more than 20 years later, I have found and experienced a great number of life-changing stories via this passion and art form which I've dedicated much of my life to exploring. Storytelling is, after all, a core element in many of the greatest games ever made, and I've seen some truly incredible leaps in the quality of the stories told in my 2+ decades playing games. With that said, if you had asked me a month ago what my favorite narrative-driven game was, I wouldn't have been very confident in giving an answer on account of just how many unforgettable stories I've enjoyed over the years. That, however, was before I had played. Before we get into the video properly, I will say Alan Wake 2 is an experience like no other, so I'll be trying to avoid major spoilers. This game is so incredible, I don't want to risk ruining it for anyone who hasn't played it, and I don't think I need to in order to convince you of its brilliance. With that said, it's also a heavily narrative-driven and plot-centric game, so if you're particularly sensitive to spoilers and already planning to play it soon, come back to this video after you've done so, just in case. I also won't be discussing controller Alan Wake 1 very much, but I did play both of them leading up to the release of Alan Wake 2 and felt doing so definitely enhanced an already wonderful story. With those things out of the way, I think it's time we loop back around to the point of this video. Let me start by saying that what follows is mostly uninhibited praise for a video game that is now one of my favorites of all time and that I believe to be one of the best ever made. I think it's important to be upfront about that because if you're here for a deeply critical look at Alan Wake 2, you're in the wrong place. I simply cannot separate how incredible my time spent with this game and its story was from how I feel about it as a product or as a piece of art. Nearly every part or chapter ended with me needing to sit back in my chair and simply take in how thoroughly and consistently my mind was being blown. So in an attempt to share with others how unrelentingly amazing this game is, I'll be breaking down and explaining exactly how I believe Alan Wake 2 evolves narrative delivery not just for video games, but for all of storytelling. Now before I can prove that rather substantial claim, I think it's important to define the two complex storytelling devices which come together to make the scene that demonstrates just how incredible this game's writing is.
Right here? What do you mean? Are they with you? Oh.
Those devices are meta-narrative and transmedia narrative. I'll get to their definitions shortly, but before that, I need to go over the basics of the plot. Keep in mind, this is very rudimentary early game stuff because I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. Anyway, the short version is that Alan Wake is a writer trapped in another dimension known as the Dark Place, and what he writes while in this place can affect it and the real world. He's trying to write a version of events where he escapes this place, but the same dark force that gives his writing power is also trapped in trying to escape. It works towards this goal by manipulating Alan and the story to make him write itself into existence. Because of this, the player, when playing as Alan, often traverses and controls different elements of multiple stories and the worlds therein. That's really all you need to know in order to understand the rest of all I'll be explaining. Now it's time to go over our first storytelling device. To start with, let's define the term meta-narrative because it's not nearly as complicated as such an imposing term might appear. A meta-narrative is simply when a story or moment within a story explores or draws attention to the telling of stories, such as by being self-referential or self-aware. Many stories make use of meta-narrative, but what makes Alan Wake 2's use of it so brilliant is how it layers multiple meta-narratives on top of each other. Now if that sounds confusing, it's because it is, but a good starting point for comparison would be the dream within a dream concept found within Christopher Nolan's Inception. The story there ends with the protagonist trapped within multiple layers of dreams, 4 to be precise. So now back to Alan Wake. Instead of dreams within dreams, think of the meta-narratives I'll be talking about as stories within stories, with each story being a world unto itself. Now here's a scuffed PowerPoint presentation to explain how many layers of meta-narrative we're talking about here and just how far this concept of stories within stories and worlds within worlds goes. Are you ready? Okay, let's dive in. To start with, we have the first layer, which is the game's story, which is written and directed in the real world by Sam Lake. Then, within that game story, we have the second layer, which is the book Alan Wake writes. Our third layer is the story within that book in which Alan writes a book or another manuscript. And the fourth layer is the story in that manuscript in which Alan is watching a TV show, which in and of itself is another story. The fifth layer is when we are in that show with Alan Wake and Sam Lake together, watching a trailer about a film based on Alan's previous novels, the Alex Casey series, in which Sam is cast as the actor playing the lead of Alex Casey. The final layer of meta-narrative is the one created by the discussion being had by Sam, Alan, and the show's host, Mr. Dorr, while they're commenting on the stories of the Alex Casey film and novels. The discussion of those stories being further catalysts for the creation of another meta-narrative which goes unexplored. So what this means is that when we see flashes of the trailer for the Alex Casey movie along with Alan and Sam during this scene, we are bearing witness to a meta-narrative that exists within 5 other layers of meta-narrative. What truly takes it to the next level is how effortlessly the game's writing pulls the player through these layers, while constantly drawing attention to the fact that this is both absurd and yet entirely in line with the rules of the game's universe. Most people likely won't realize just how deep this goes until the game itself references that absurdity and owns it. It's not just writing for the sake of writing. The creation of these meta-narrative layers exists as a plot device for Alan to use and manipulate in order to achieve his goals. This hit me almost immediately in the scene before this one when Mr. Dorr makes a reference to how this is all so meta, he feels he might just poof out of existence. I was shook so hard by that scene and another that follows our example, which I wouldn't dare rob you of by spoiling it, that it brought me there and back again like a hobbit, and when it ended I had to pick my jaw up off the floor. While I maintain that this alone is impressive in and of itself, what really takes it all to the next level is understanding how these meta-narrative layers are combined with the focus of our next section. Much like meta-narrative, transmedia narrative sounds like a more complicated thing than it is. A transmedia narrative is just when a story or elements of that story are told across different artistic mediums or forms of media. So for example, Final Fantasy XV rightfully receives a lot of criticism for doing this poorly and separating important world building, character moments, and plot points, all fundamental to understanding the wider canon of the story, across a bunch of random media. This includes a series of animated shorts, a full-length CG film, and basically all of the trailers being made canon, just to name a few things. So that's our bad example of a transmedia narrative, and now this would be the part where I show you a good example, but they're very hard to pull off well, and the truth is I couldn't think of any games I've played that did so in a meaningful way. But that's a perfect segue into the very special thing that Alan Wake 2 does with this device: build a self-contained transmedia narrative. By self-contained, I mean that rather than build out the story via content across other platforms, Alan Wake 2 enhances and deepens its storytelling with written material, live-action scenes, and music that all exist within the canon of the game's world while simultaneously existing within the game for us to experience as players. You don't need to read or watch anything outside of the game itself, which is what makes it self-contained. While its predecessor and Control both dabbled in this, I always found it felt somewhat gimmicky, artsy just for the sake of it. But in Alan Wake 2, there are layers upon layers of narrative cohesion that constantly reinforce themselves via this much more committed and considerate use of what I would call gimmicks in a lesser game. The use of live-action scenes and their flawless integration with the rest of the game is truly remarkable, and a big part of what makes it so smart is the way the story contextualizes them within the game's world. They aren't just there for flavor most of the time, but rather to draw specific parallels in the narrative or as a means of indicating different plot-related circumstances to the player. Those parallels and narrative indicators come in the form of why specific characters and scenes are chosen to be portrayed in live action. I actually had to rack my brain about this for quite a while when asked exactly that by my friend Lemon. It dawned on me that no live action scene takes place outside of the Dark Place. Every single instance of live action, with the possible exception of the Koskela brothers' amazing ads, depicts scenes specifically taking place outside of the game's first and second meta-narrative layers, which, if you were paying close attention, may have already noticed when I was going through the meta-narrative section. While I obviously didn't put it together until much later, the fact that this clever use of transmedia narrative doubles as a plot-relevant indicator of which scenes take place in the Dark Place and which ones don't is, like the rest of the game, truly genius. And with that, I've hopefully done a decent job of explaining the two separate storytelling devices and how they're presented in Alan Wake 2 in ways that individually improve the story. Now, to back up the claim I stated in the beginning of the video, the Alan Wake 2 evolves storytelling by combining the two devices featured in the previous sections. This brings us full circle back to the same scene that I used to demonstrate the game's use of meta-narrative. If you've been following along, you can probably see where this is going, but as I laid out in the explanation of meta-narrative layers, the stories within stories don't just exist within a single form of media, but within no less than 4 depending on how loose we are with the definition. First, we've got the video game, with which Sam Lake and Remedy Studios deliver a story. Then within the game's story, Alan Wake, as one of the protagonists, has written a book, within which we experience the story from Alan and Saga's perspectives. Within that same story, we then listen to diegetic music, which is played in the game world like over an in-game jukebox or radio, read different forms of text, and watch a combination of live-action TV commercials and scenes. Alan also writes a manuscript in this layer that we're dragged into with him, and from within this layer of this manuscript, we interact with the TVs that drag us into the live-action scenes on Mr. Door's show. I think you get the point by seeing all those different types of media, from TV commercials, manuscripts, television shows. Yeah, you get the idea. Hopefully I've made it clear just how ridiculous and impressive this is, especially when considered within the context of a video game. That is to say, Remedy have very intentionally chosen to use meta-narrative and transmedia narrative to dissolve the ludonarrative dissonance that in a lesser game would tear apart any sense of appreciation for this story's combination of sincere and self-serious narrative with wonderfully self-aware satire. For anyone not familiar with ludonarrative dissonance or needing a refresher, it's just when a game's objectives and gameplay seem to contradict or fail to respect the goals of the characters within the story. A classic example is how you can do just about anything you want in Fallout 4 with little reason not to, despite the player character's main motivation being the tracking down of their kidnapped child. Now, the way Alan Wake 2 sidesteps this kind of immersion-breaking phenomena so brilliantly is by making the player engage with and manipulate these meta-narratives and transmedia narratives as gameplay. This takes on many forms, one of which is entering or being transported into these meta-narrative story layers as playable and non-playable segments based on the specific form of transmedia narrative within which that layer simultaneously exists. This goes even so far as being able to rearrange the physical spaces within them by selecting which version of a story Alan actively writes in the layers above. This further grounds the player in this amazing story and helps create a narrative you truly experience rather than simply watch, read, listen to, or play through. It's this considerate and choreographed integration of different media into the narrative that makes Alan Wake 2 not only a peak video game story, but a story that can only be told in a video game. Alan Wake 2 is, in my not-so-humble opinion, an absolutely triumphant evolution of how video games tell stories. It embraces the meta to a comical but brilliant degree, and dissolves ludonarrative dissonance with some of the most self-referential and clever writing I have ever experienced in a video game or any other medium for that matter. I truly believe it will be some time before we're gifted with a game of this caliber. And for that reason, I'd like to personally thank Sam Lake and everyone at Remedy Studios for the unforgettable experience that playing Alan Wake 2 was, and for the spiral of a journey it sent my mind on. While it has elements of the gameplay and performance I could nitpick for criticism, it's ultimately a rock-solid third-person survival horror game through and through, and as I laid out in my first ever YouTube video, minor gameplay or technical issues are not uncommon in games with the ambition required to achieve a 9 or a 10. And make no mistake, Alan Wake 2 is without a doubt a 10 out of 10, an unrivaled masterpiece and one of the only games I would ever dare to call narrative perfection. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the little bell if you want to be notified for my next video. I also do variety game streaming 5 days a week starting at 12 PM Pacific Standard Time, which is where I capture my gameplay footage used in these videos and play through the games covered on this channel. Link to my Twitch channel, Discord, and more in the description. Thanks again, and see you next time.